to strengthen their organizations, and that you're able to gather tangible insights and takeaways. As we all know, corporate purpose has become a buzzword in our industry, but it's so much more than that. During a time of eroding brand trust and increasing consumer skepticism, corporate purpose has emerged as a key driver in advancing strategic transformation, innovation, and growth. Organizations that have a defined purpose are proving more effective in growing their businesses, attracting and retaining top talent, and building strong and resilient brands. Our panel today includes CCOs from a diverse mix of companies who will discuss with us how their corporations have introduced and maintained a purpose-driven approach to doing business and how it's benefiting their respective organizations. Our panelists are Tom Noland, who's Senior Vice President of Corporate Communications at Humana, and Tom is also a member of the Page Purpose Committee, where he co-heads the Corporate Character Subcommittee. We have Colleen Penhall, Vice President of Corporate Communications at Lowe's, and we have Michael Sneed, Worldwide Vice President and Global Corporate Affairs and Chief Communications Officer for Johnson & Johnson. You will note that we've listed the Twitter handles for our panelists on our webinar screen, as well as our Page Connect hashtag. And we encourage you to share any comments and ideas that come up during the webinar that you find inspiring. So now let's quickly review our agenda. We're going to begin with Tom providing us with some background on the Page Purpose Committee and the work that our group is leading. Our panelists are then going to walk us through several short case studies detailing some of the work that they've done within their respective organizations. And finally, we're going to host a panel conversation with our panelists that I'll moderate. Midway through the discussion, I'm going to call on you, our audience, to raise questions for the panelists. I'll tell you now that there's two ways that you'll be able to ask questions. On your screen, you can hit the hand button to raise your hand, and we'll then unmute your mics to entertain your questions. So you should be able to see that on your screen right now. You can also type the question into the chat window in the box on what should be the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll later be asking questions on the audience's behalf. So there's those two ways. I'm going to go through those again when we get to the Q&A. A final house cleaning item is that all of our attendees and audience members will receive a short survey after the webinar. We ask that you please take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. As everyone knows, because we all work in communications, those surveys are so helpful in helping us put forward great content for our members. So let's get started. I'm going to begin by asking Tom Noland to tell us about the Page Purpose Committee. Tom, it's all you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and welcome everybody. It's a very exciting topic. I know that's why we have such great attendance today, and we'll hope to make this worthy of your time. So very briefly, the Purpose Committee is a subset of the Thought Leadership Committee. Many of you have already had exposure to the work of the Purpose Committee, either by being members of it yourselves, like Joe, or the last two spring seminars in New York, Page Spring Seminars. Many of you have actually attended the two workshops we've had in successive years there. The co-chair along with me of the Purpose Group is Meryl McDonald, and we get a lot of terrific professional and academic help from Marcia DiStaso, who, as many of you know, is the head of the Public Relations Department at the University of Florida, and of course a professor in that department as well. There are 5 work streams in the Purpose Group: knowledge, research, partnerships, content, and co-creation. And the 5th of those work streams, co-creation, really has everything to do with this webinar, because another way to think about co-creation is member engagement. And that's what this webinar is all about, engaging all of you on it to share, if you will, in the purpose of the Purpose Group. And I'll end with this. And that's simply to bring purpose closer to the center rather than the periphery of any organization's work. And I know that the panelists will get into this, and you will too when you ask questions. What do you mean by the center versus the periphery, and how has indeed purpose evolved in organizations over the years? But I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much, and again, back to you, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So let's now get immersed in some of the work that Page members are leading in the purpose space. We're going to begin by asking Colleen Penhall to speak to us about Lowe's and her work to help define, or as she might say, uncover her company's purpose. Colleen?
Thanks so much, Joe. I appreciate it. I first thought I'd give you a little bit of context around why we developed our purpose. Several years ago, we were going through a number of acquisitions, and we found ourselves asking, how do we galvanize all of these businesses that Lowe's now owns under a single unifying purpose, really all aimed towards our North Star? We also, from a communications perspective, had a proliferation of corporate lingo, vision, mission, brand purpose, values, and we really wanted to consolidate and simplify that for the organization. So that was another benefit of thinking about purpose as well. We also talked about what we did, but never why we did it. And we really needed a lens for prioritizing what's best for the customer, not just what's most efficient or what, frankly, delivers the best financial results. So the purpose was to identify, to unify, and fuel our standing portfolio businesses and future growth opportunities. And through all the research that we've done, we know that having a purpose beyond making money almost always results in making more money. So if you go to the next slide, first, we asked our leaders to define criteria for developing a purpose statement. We really wanted to make sure that there was authenticity in it. We also wanted to include the voices of customers and employees and identify best practices to feed and grow our purpose. The second step was to talk to many companies that may be on the phone today that are currently purpose-driven. And we reached out to those companies and really understood what their journey was and how they came up with a purpose statement. And then the third, and this was really important, was to ask our employee base and customers to help us crystallize the opportunity. We set up focus groups with employees across the organization and asked, although maybe not quite as overtly, why do you come to work every day? What drives you? And through those conversations and through customer engagement, it was very clear, and our purpose really developed out of that, which is to help people love where they live. And so at that point, we knew it was very authentic to who we are because our employees had essentially stated it and our customers felt it as well. So if you go to the next slide, once we had a defined purpose, which is to help people love where they live, we looked at our existing values and realized they needed to be more aligned. Again, we went through an assessment and co-creation process with our employees to incorporate what was good about our current value system combined with where we wanted to go. And so you can see here, we created that architecture of, we've got a purpose statement of why we exist, a set of refreshed values, which is what's important to us, to drive our desired culture, which is who we are and how we behave. So the big question was, how do we roll this out to the organization so it's authentically believed and not an add-on or a marketing campaign? And I'll tell you, the key learning I have here is we took our time. And we followed a be, do, say model. And so if you go to the next slide, what I'll share is we didn't talk about purpose for a year. We wanted to really engage leadership. And so we engaged a group of leaders as well as front runners, about 700 employees from across the organization on our purpose and values through leader-led immersion experiences. Through that, we also started with what we called our Whisper campaign, and we were really building evidence in of our purpose in our organization. We wanted to stay true to our history and who we are as a company. So we built a narrative around the purpose, and we identified symbols in our culture that indicated our purpose has been a part of who we are since we were founded. One of them is the fact, quite frankly, that we wear a red vest. And so we started asking questions of our employees, what does the red vest mean to you? And ultimately, they talked about service and going above and beyond for the customer and doing things that ultimately helped a customer envision their dream. And we took that as a seed of an idea and started to populate editorially, what is your red vest moment? So this was the really grassroots perspective that we had, where we were gathering stories and then retelling those stories in a very organic way. The other thing that we did from a do perspective, that in accordance with both our purpose and values and making customer-centric decisions, we set up a purpose activation team to really look at our policies and practices to make sure we were starting to make decisions with that lens. And then finally, we really had to strategically decide how do we roll this out to the organization? When it was time to say, this is our purpose statement, after a year of really seeding and building evidence of our purpose in the organization, we strategically decided to not roll out our purpose and 5 values all at one time. It's a lot of messaging for the organization, and so we purposefully started with our purpose and spent a year talking about our purpose before then the following year talking about our values. And so when we rolled out our purpose, we talk about uncovering our purpose because it was always there under the surface, but really never allowed to shine or be in the forefront. We had CEO leader-led events with the customer front and center, and we spent an entire year immersing our organization and what it means to customers to love where they live. And this really included leader-led events, leader toolkits, editorial calendars, storytelling, and internal branding efforts. Our employees were also heavily involved in the creation and ultimately the activation of our purpose. So we gave approximately 245,000 of our employees a small wooden block and asked them to write, what does home mean to you? And we took everyone's individual block and used it to create new corporate branding at each of our facilities, whether it was a store, distribution center, or corporate office. And so now everyone's diverse voice is a permanent representation of why we come to work every day. And so that was really important for us as we thought about engaging the organization. It also solved a problem, which is we had old corporate messaging in all of these facilities, and we needed to refresh it. So we really involved our employees in that process. And then finally, we spent the entire year following that just focused on our values. And I would say today, our internal communication strategy is built around this storytelling, and it feels authentic to who we are. We continually tell stories about purpose-driven decisions. And at the time we launched our purpose, and since then we have had the best employee engagement scores in more than 4 years and saw a significant reduction in customer complaints. Our purpose continually serves as the inspiration for knowing that what we do matters to people, and it's why we come to work every day at Lowe's. And so with that, that's the conclusion of my case study, and I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. We'll now go to Michael Sneed from Johnson & Johnson, who will tell us how his team helped an iconic brand find its true north. Michael.
Hey, Joe, thanks, and thanks everybody for being part of the seminar or the webinar. So a couple of things. One, let me just start by talking about the fact that for Johnson & Johnson, purpose is actually something we've always had. For those of you who know anything about J&J, you know that we have started and really built the company on our credo. But we really had an opportunity for the first time to really define what that purpose was. So we are perhaps a little bit further behind than Colleen and Lowe's in that we're in the beginning stages of embedding purpose, the specific definition into our organization, and also enabling the world to see what we stood for more than 130 years. So if we go to the second slide there, Joe. And what you'll see here is a set of 4 images. And the first one is it's image of our credo. And we like to say at J&J that we are the original purpose-driven company in many ways. We've stood for ideas and represented ideals that go way beyond our products and services. And for many years, our credo was really our de facto mission. It really calls us to put the needs of people over profit and basically informs everything that we do as an enterprise. And then later on, our mission was really, I think it was expressed by our aspiration, which at the time we talked about caring one person at a time. We're going to help billions of people live longer, healthier, and happier lives. But we always felt that this didn't really completely and totally encompass what our true purpose was all about. And so in 2016, given the fact that we saw a rapidly changing healthcare industry and an industry that was evolving in terms of expectations across our stakeholders, we thought we needed to put a stake in the ground for who we are, what we stand for, and certainly the impact we have on the world. If you look at the second image, we understand that for years, Johnson & Johnson has held a very unique place in the world's collective heart as kind of known as the trusted mother and baby company. We've been associated with safety and quality and improving lives. And so we knew that we were thriving in what we called heart share. We knew we had very strong heart share among our myriad stakeholders, but we were really falling behind in terms of mind share. Most stakeholders really didn't have a good understanding of the breadth and the depth of Johnson & Johnson, and frankly, the overall impact that we had on the health of people around the world. So even though people knew all about our baby products, and obviously those have been used by tens of millions of families around the world, people were surprised to find that we were the world's largest and most innovative pharmaceutical company, that we lead the world when it comes to global public health challenges like Ebola and HIV, things like that. And so it really dawned upon us that we were often a 130-year-old company that nobody really truly knows. And so in a world where there is an increasing challenge to make sure that you stand out, we wanted to make sure that we really did stand out, and that J&J, as we looked at it, kind of faced a relevancy gap. And the question was, how do we make sure that we remain relevant? So if you look at the third image, this was really in addition to this notion of trying to make sure we were relevant. We knew that there has been and there continues to be an incredible period of disruption and change, but also great opportunity within the healthcare system. People were taking a look at healthcare and continuing to define it differently. People were thinking about their health more holistically. Technology was allowing us to deliver healthcare in a number of new and different ways. And yet at the same time, we knew that healthcare continues to remain very costly and frankly out of reach for the world's most vulnerable people. And so on that fourth image, you'll see that we had an opportunity to really start to pivot and adapt and evolve who we are as an organization. And so we set about trying to define what we call our true north. And it was really an expression of who we are on our best day at Johnson & Johnson. And to really lay out a big and a bold aspiration for the future that really keeps us relevant in the world's mind and also relevant in the world's heart. So we did a lot of, similar to Lowe's, we did a lot of global research, a lot of stakeholder interviews. We also encompassed all of our senior management as well as our CEO. And we pulled together leaders across the enterprise from all of the businesses, all of the geographies, levels, people who were new to the company, people who had been at the company 30 plus years. And their remit was a pretty tough one, which was, how do we create a purpose that everyone in our 250 operating companies around the world can rally around? But I'm really happy to say that that's what we did. It resulted in a purpose statement that's reflected both in what we stood for since our earliest days and also one that we'll continue to drive towards in our future. So if you go to the third slide there, what you'll see there is our purpose statement. We call it Finding Our Truth. And as you see there on the left-hand side, it's we blend heart, science, and ingenuity to profoundly change the trajectory of health for humanity. And this was really profound in many ways. It was a purpose that immediately spoke to all of our people. It wasn't a hard sell, quite honestly, because it's something that really is unique and it's really special about Johnson & Johnson. You know, it talks about our heart. We're a company that is a global community of people who really believe it's a privilege to do what we do. It's not just a job. It's about our science. We combine great scientific rigor and knowledge across our 250 businesses. But it's also about the ingenuity that we have across the organization to try and achieve the impossible. And lastly, we wanted to figure out, what does it really mean to profoundly change the trajectory of health for humanity? It's a big statement, but it's also one that we felt we sat in a unique place to be able to do that. So it's very inspirational, it's aspirational. Importantly, it's united all of our 130,000 employees, whatever their role is, and whatever corner of the world that they reside in. And certainly my role as the CCO was really to make sure I became kind of the chief integrator, in making sure that this not only was driven across our leadership at the highest level, but throughout our organization. It's clearly not communications in its traditional sense, because ultimately this becomes what our strategic framework is all about as an organization, and how we drive the organization forward. So very pleased with it. We're just in the process now of, as we move into 2018, starting to do much more external work around our purpose. But it's very exciting times for Johnson & Johnson. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I think that what our audience is seeing is that across many of these case studies, comms teams are breaking the boundaries of what would typically fall within traditional communications, as Michael so aptly worded it, which I think is a good segue to go back to Tom, who will speak to us about some of the work that's been happening at Humana as they proceeded in an ongoing journey to define their corporate purpose. Tom?
Thank you very much, Joe, and two terrific presentations. So I'd like to pick up on a comment that Michael made. He called J&J perhaps the first truly purpose-driven company. We may be the last. And by that I mean we're a company founded in 1961. Like J&J, we're a health-oriented company, but unlike them, we've done a lot of different things in our 56 years, and I think that is partly why it's only in recent years that we've gotten very focused and intentional around purpose. In 1961, we were a single Louisville, Kentucky nursing home. We remain headquartered in Louisville. We became the largest nursing home conglomerate in the U.S. In the 70s. We were the largest hospital company in the U.S. In the 80s, we tried to do two things at once. They were contradictory, as we learned. We owned hospitals, and then we started a health insurance division. The hospitals had the purpose, if you will, of keeping people in the hospital, and the insurance side had the purpose of keeping them out. You can see right away what a communications challenge that was. I was there then, so I know. In 1993, the company split in half, and I went with the insurance side. The hospital side eventually was sold. So let's then fast forward to 2008. That's when we first began to get intentional around purpose. And the reason was because we suspected, it wasn't yet time for this, that our relationship with our customers would have to evolve. We were in 2008 a classic health insurance company who dealt with our health plan members transactionally, meaning we either paid a claim or denied it. That's a transaction. That's not a relationship. But we again suspected that sooner or later, probably sooner, we'd have to substitute a relationship for a transactional relationship, and we'd have to work with them to co-create their own best health. There was a business driver for that, as well as a sort of, well, if you will, a proto-purpose driver. What we eventually came up with, as you see here on the next slide, is the purpose of to help people achieve lifelong well-being. And as I already mentioned, we really started from zero to get to that point. There was much resistance up and down the line in the corporation. I gave you a sort of single line or two sentences to explain it. Why? We're doing fine without it. It was considered a distraction from strategy rather than a fulfillment or a contributor to it. And the whole idea of having a corporate purpose was considered too soft. So that was the situation a decade ago. Next slide, please. Then we had a breakthrough. And in our case, the breakthrough was calling on outside help. Some of you may have worked with the consultant Lance Secretan. Very unusual fellow. I won't belabor everything about Lance. You can look him up online, but he's had a remarkable career. He's a physical daredevil as well as a corporate consultant daredevil. And he came to this staid old traditional insurance company and said, all you need is love. Boy, was that an uphill climb. First, we thought he was crazy. Then we thought he was half crazy. And then to cut to the chase, we finally realized that what Lance really was bold, courageous, and arresting. And he was actually giving us what we really needed, which was, if you're going to have a relationship with your customers, at the end of the day, you might as well admit it. You have to love them. That's what you have to do. If you don't love them, you're not going to care about them. If you don't care about them, you're not going to try to help them improve their health. And this was the real breakthrough, if you don't try to help them improve their health in the developing, evolving world of health insurance and health care, your profits were going to go down, not up. So in the interest of time, I will conclude by saying in a briefer form a lot of what both Colleen and Michael had to say, which was, once we got on board with Lance, we involved all 50,000 of our employees. We had focus groups, surveys. What do you think? How can we express this idea of loving your members and your customers in a way that can provide a unifying purpose for the firm? We did come up, as you already know, with helping people achieve lifelong well-being as the purpose. And from that breakthrough, which is now 10 years old, we developed values that flow from it, which we still have, guiding behaviors that flow from the values, and very much like Colleen's experience at Lowe's, lo and behold, our engagement scores have gone way up. They're now world-class, according to Connexa. And indeed, the company is more profitable, not less. And the leadership recognizes that a big part of why has to do with getting focused and intentional around purpose. So with that, I'll end and throw it back to Joe.
Okay, now, Tom, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for walking through these very rich case studies and sharing your insights with our membership. We're far from done. We're now going to move into our panel conversation. My first question, which will be for all of our panelists, is what was the biggest singular challenge that you faced in introducing purpose into your organization? Let's start with Colleen, then we'll go to Michael, then we'll go back to Tom. Colleen?
Sure. So I think one thing that you have to guard against is that you make it a marketing campaign or a slogan. So oftentimes we roll out new marketing efforts and it's seen as sort of a tagline and people want to use it in that way, or that you want to get too cute with marketing internally. I think you just need to guard against that and remember that this is the underpinning of why you come to work every day. It is not a marketing campaign.
And Colleen stole my thunder, but I'll add to that because I do think that's always the danger is making sure that it doesn't exist in isolation. And so we didn't want it either to be a tagline or a campaign. But I'd go back and also say that for us as Johnson & Johnson, because we had the credo, the biggest challenge was getting people to understand, well, why do we need to have a purpose? It's embedded in our credo. And it was really getting them to the point where we had to define it in a crisper way for today's world where everything is in 7-second sound bites. We needed to make sure that we were crystal clear on our purpose for all of our emerging stakeholders.
Yeah, and this is Tom. I think for us, the biggest challenge, and really it took counterintuitive thinking to put this over the top. Conventional thinking will tell you that if you come up with a great purpose statement and you're really not yet doing it in your strategy, that's a mistake. What we actually found is that as long as your strategy aspirationally and practically, not just aspirationally, is going toward the purpose and you can actually demonstrate progress along the way, it's really okay to say something, in our case, like to help people achieve lifelong well-being before you're actually doing that. So we had a situation where really eventually the strategy caught up with the purpose, and it all turned out all right for us. But again, it took some bold, counterintuitive thinking on the front end to do that.
So thank you all. We're gonna move to the next question. I'm gonna ask Michael, and then for the other panelists, please feel free to piggyback onto his response. Michael, you said that you see the role of CCO or you embrace the role of chief integrator. I'd like you to expand on that. What would you say is that the role of CCO? Is it chief integrator? Is there more to it?
I think, well, let me define it. Let me define chief integrator as one where it's certainly my role to articulate the value of why this is important to the enterprise, certainly. But the definition of being an integrator here is that I have to get our leaders to own this as much as I do. And so I think that's the role that I play, is that I got to get them to say, yeah, I actually own this, and I own this for my particular company, my particular function, and get people to really embrace it. And then we, of course, help them along. So I can lead that charge, but ultimately for it to be successful, our leaders have got to feel like I'm as invested in this as the total corporation is.
Colleen or Tom, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, this is Colleen. The only thing I would add to that is I think oftentimes you're receiving or, part of business decisions. And I think your role is to say, is that a purpose-driven decision? Is it in line with our purpose and our values? And really make sure you can ask the tough questions and make sure that the business is making decisions based on that mindset.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing to it, and that is I really think that really driving purpose requires us, frankly, as chief communications officers, to deepen our business knowledge and business acumen of our industries and our companies to a level that is unheard of, and certainly was unheard of even just a few years ago. We have to be so allied with the business goals of the enterprise that we're not just looked at as, well, okay, that's just something the CCO wants to do because that's the PR department. So that's really we have to take on that responsibility joyfully, frankly, and not just as a burden.
And Tom, if I could just add on to that, Tom, because I think that's a great point. I know at J&J, this only works because this is part of our strategic framework. To your point, it doesn't sit outside of our framework, but it is how we drive the business. And I'm only as credible as I am in part because I have a deep understanding of how the business works inside of Johnson & Johnson. How we make our products, how we deliver, our services, how we make money for the corporation. So to the extent that you have great credibility on the business side, it allows you to then drive the purpose throughout the organization.
Great conversation. I'm going to go to Colleen with the next question. And again, panelists, please feel free to piggyback onto this response with additional responses. Colleen, how have you measured purpose within Lowe's?
Sure. Well, there are certain customer measures that we look at and key performance indicators. But the one thing I'll mention is that we really wanted to hardwire it into our accountability system. And so for leadership in the company, which is for us at a director and above level, we are measured on our purpose and values as experienced by our customers internally. Our teams experience us as well as customers, and it's part of tied to our compensation. And so I would just say from an accountability perspective, we're incentivized to drive and inspire people with our purpose and behave in a way that helps to fulfill that purpose. And quite frankly, if we're not doing that we're penalized for that. So I think that's one of the unique learnings and perspectives that I would bring is that it really does need to be hardwired into your accountability systems.
Yeah, and this is Tom. I'll just add on to that. A lot of you use the Cision Corporation to measure how you're doing in earned media, not only against yourselves quarter to quarter, but against your industry peers. We do that. And about 5 years ago, we actually asked Cision to customize even more the way they measure how we're doing in earned media through PR recall and net reach and their other measures to really see whether purpose, and specifically the way we like to express our purpose, is making it into the coverage of Humana. Even the positive stories, great, it's a positive story rated as such by Cision, terrific, but is our purpose in there? Is it in there the right way? So that's been a really helpful way to measure on our side.
And Michael, I know that you've spoken a bit about the Cradle Survey and the Reputation Index. Can you just speak a little bit about how you've leveraged those for measurement?
Sure. So every other year we do a Cradle Survey among all 130,000 employees. We ask the organization as a management team, how are we and how are your individual managers living up to the tenets of our Cradle? So it really provides us a very good scorecard in terms of how are we doing that. Really good metrics. One, we get we get about 95% engagement on the survey itself, which is tremendous. And then our overall positive response is in the mid 80s. So it's really remarkable. In addition to that, since we've started this work on our purpose, we have developed what we call the Enterprise Reputation Index. And that really allows us to not just talk with our employees, but talk to every stakeholder group to see how are we doing with regard to delivering on our purpose. And we've done it now for a number of years. We're in 19 different countries. And so we are able to really understand how are we doing relative to different stakeholders, relative to different markets, and relative to some competitors. And we know down to the individual market and individual stakeholder group if we're doing well and if we're not. And what's great is because it shows up on our corporate scorecard, like Colleen was saying, if we see a wobble, then action is taken by those individual leaders in that market. So everyone knows exactly where they stand with regard to our Cradle score and our purpose metrics.
So going back to Tom, building on some of the earlier comments that you made, how can the CCO help to make purpose front and center in the mind and actions of the CEO?
Well, I think it's easy for us CCOs to forget that, the CEO has a boss too, right? He's the C or she is the CEO, but she or he is measured every year, same way we are. It's just that actually the CEO has several bosses, the board of directors. So, at least what I've done is in my relationship first with our previous CEO and now with the current one, it's a pretty easy matter to find out how the CEO is going to be judged every year. In most cases, she or he will just tell you. And when you meet with her or him, you explain, so this is why purpose is not just a nice to do addition to your goals and how you're going to be measured this year, but rather this is a need to do means by which you can achieve your goals, the very things you're measured by, the same way any employee is measured. And I've just found that again, I've tried it now with 2 people, and it's worked in each instance, and it's just plain common sense. So getting to the heart of what keeps the CEO up at night in terms of how she or he is measured and showing how purpose is a contributor to achieving those measurements is the way that I've done it. There are probably other ways that other panelists and the folks on the call can talk about too.
So Colleen, I'll give you a chance to expand on that, or Michael. How can the CCO help to make purpose front and center in the mind and actions of their CEO?
So this is Colleen. I'll start. Well, first, I would just say it really does help if your CEO does believe in it. So I started from a different place where our CEO was very much bought in to having a purpose-driven company. So I was in a little bit of a different situation. But I would just add on to that and say, I think, one, there's a lot of data out there. If you look at the Stengel top 50 brands versus the S&P 500 of those who have had a purpose versus those who do not and how they perform. So I would look at data. The second thing is if you need a partner, I would talk to your head of HR because right now there's a war for talent. Unemployment is very low. And so as you think about differentiating yourself as an organization and millennials and new generations of folks that are looking for jobs, they want to do something of meaning. And this can be a real differentiator for you from a recruiting standpoint as well. So I would say, use your HR partner or, your head of HR to help build that story as well, in addition to, obviously, from a customer perspective.
So I have a question for Michael. So Michael, for members who are in highly matrixed organizations, what are some best practices for implementing purpose at the business unit level?
So for us, and as you might guess, J&J is highly matrixed in many ways. As I said earlier, we've got over 250 operating companies, but centers of excellence when it comes to finance and R&D and et cetera. supply chain. So for us to be successful, we knew that this couldn't be seen as just an enterprise or a corporate effort. And so from the beginning, we developed what we called an activators network. And these were leaders from the business and the functions who really were the conduits back to the business, who could talk the language that the businesses needed to hear, who were known entities to the business, and yet they could advocate for what the work had to be done. So I think that was something that we found to be incredibly useful. We had about 35 to 40 of these individuals, all high-profile people who were leaders in their own right, but had a lot of familiarity with the various organizations, had a lot of strong standing. And then, of course, that was reiterated by the management committee themselves, who were also great activators, if you will, of what the work was, and helped to drive it and really start to bring it to life.
Colleen, I'm going to direct this to you. If you'd like to expand on what you've done at Lowe's, and I know some of it isn't just the business unit level, it's also global and cultural considerations. How are some of the ways that you've cascaded purpose and secured buy-in throughout the enterprise?
Sure. So we really started with our primary U.S. home improvement business, the Lowe's Big Box, and learned things across that, but essentially had, an activation in a box, if you will, in terms of how did we roll it out, what were the types of materials and assets that we used, how did we position it, what were some of the speeches and key messages that we used, and we worked with our international partners to be able to frame that up for them and use it as a toolkit to roll out to their organization. So we did have a staged rollout, and they had the benefit of our thinking of, hey, this worked well, this didn't work as well. And then from there, they were able to customize it slightly to make it as culturally relevant as possible. So we have operations in Mexico, for example. So some of the translation of that had to be modified slightly so that it was more appropriate for that specific audience, but they had the latitude to do that. But essentially, with all of our allied businesses, whether they're in the U.S. or internationally, everyone would be able to tell you what our purpose and core values are because they're consistent throughout.
Okay. Thank you, Colleen. We're now going to open the floor for audience questions. So I'm going to, again, repeat what I'd said at the onset of the call as far as the instructions on how to ask questions. So for our audience, on your screen in a moment, you can hit the hand button to raise your hand, and we'll then unmute your mics to entertain your questions. You can type your question, another way is you can type your question into the chat window in the box, which should be on the right hand of your screen. And I can then ask the questions on your behalf. So again, two options. One is to hit the button where you can raise your hand and I'll unmute your mics. The other is to type in a question into the chat box. So please proceed in asking questions. As we wait for those to come in, I'm going to ask another question of our panel. Sticking with Colleen, could you speak to us a little bit about how you reinforce your purpose-driven culture today? And other panelists, please feel free to piggyback on with responses.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we always want to do is highlight purpose-driven decisions that were being made in the organization, especially if it's a tough decision. We have leader-led communications that highlight the types of decisions that we're making and the reason we chose one that may be more customer-centric and we thought it would help people love where they live. The second thing we do is through, I would say, reward and recognition. So highlighting at a very local level and equipping managers to have tools to reward and recognize their employees when they see them behaving in a way that drives a purpose driven action. And it can be those small things that matter, going above and beyond for our customer and demonstrating one of our values. And so we provide them with those tools to be able to, again, on a local level, highlight and celebrate those accomplishments. So we do have, through our editorial calendar, a constant highlight of these types of stories so that people can see what good looks like, both at a very enterprise level as well as a local level.
Yeah, and this is Tom with just a brief follow-on. So at Humana, we quantify our purpose. Recall that our purpose is to help people achieve lifelong well-being. Came up with that, as you heard me say, about a decade ago. And then 2 years after that, in 2010, we came up with what we call our bold goal, which is to improve the health of the communities we serve 20% by 2020. So you can see right away that plays right off of helping people achieve lifelong well-being, but it puts a quantitative parameter around it. We then have developed a number of measures to just show the world that indeed you can improve the health of communities by improving the health of the individuals in them, not only through objective measures like, smoking rates decline and blood pressure gets better, but even subjective measures like asking people. There's a measurement that the Centers for Disease Control has called Healthy Days. You ask somebody, how many unhealthy physical and or mental days did you have last month? 5, 6, 7? And hopefully improve that. So quantifying purpose is a way that we've reinforced it.
I have a question for our panelists that relates to cultural considerations and global and just executing purpose on a global scale. Colleen touched on this earlier, but for Michael and Tom and Colleen, if you'd like to add more, what are some of the things that you need to think about when rolling out a purpose-driven initiative on a global scale? I'll go to Michael with that one.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very important consideration. For us, as we were going through the process, we needed to make sure that the ideas we were talking about could actually translate to how people viewed it. We had a lot of interesting conversations around how do you do that, because it goes even to mundane things as words in English don't necessarily translate the same way in different languages. So that was another reason why it was important to develop this activators network across the organization from our global leaders as well, so that what we were saying here in English, here in the U.S., was something that could be universal, no matter where you were. So that was, I think you have to be very deliberate. When we started to roll out materials, we developed videos and materials in 16 different languages. So again, we were really speaking to people in their native language. But those things are important because it signals to the organization that they're making the extra effort to make me feel included. And that can be obviously very powerful in building momentum for whatever initiative you have in this area.
I'm going to Elliot Mizrahi on the page team. I'm having trouble reading 2 of the questions that came in. I know that we had 2 written questions. Would you mind asking on my behalf some of the questions from our audience?
Absolutely, Joe. We have a question here from Jennifer Rivera. She asks, when seeking internal buy-in, it's helpful to have specific case studies to reference. Do you have any specific examples of a company that defined a purpose and saw measurable benefits as a result?
So, Tom, I'll pass that to you. Elliot, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Jennifer Rivera is looking for specific examples of a company that defined its purpose and saw measurable benefits as a result.
Sure. Well, that almost sounds like a plant, even though I know it's not, because as Elliot well knows, within this so-called content work stream of the purpose group, and you heard me allude to that at the top of the call, that's exactly the work that we're doing. The members of the content work stream, each of them has volunteered to do a case study of a corporation that's done just that, that has adopted a purpose, driven it through the organization, and then achieved certain results. And the good news is that whereas of necessity, today Michael, Colleen, and myself talked about our own companies, these case studies are being done by members of the content work stream, not of their own firms, but of other firms. I'm doing, for example, Brown Forman, which is a company here in Louisville that sells spirits and whatnot. So there's going to be a lot of that very soon. Again, as Elliot well knows, we're looking toward the end of this month even, or perhaps by the middle of February at the latest, to have these case studies gathered. And very shortly after that, we'll make them available.
So, Colleen and Michael, have you seen any case studies that you've gathered learnings from or that you'd point to as best practice?
I haven't. I have not. So that's the short answer. But I would say, and this really piggybacks on Tom's, and I think what Colleen said earlier, is a lot of this is going to be, as you think through it, it's really going to be having your organization understand there's a value in terms of employee engagement, et cetera. But there's a lot of data out there now that talks to the financial value of organizations that have strong purposes. And again, at Johnson & Johnson, we're not shy about talking about the fact that our Cradle really is our overall strategic plan. And that if you look at how we've done financially, whether it's the last 1, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we handily outperform the market and outperform our competitive set. And we make no bones about it. It's because we start with our credo and the values and the purpose embedded within them.
And I would just say, as part of our research, we talk to companies like Zappos and Ben & Jerry's and Harley. REI is another one that I know lives, for its purpose and makes purpose-driven decisions. So I think there's a lot of different companies out there that you could look to. How did they unveil their purpose? What sort of returns is it paying today? So there's a number of them. And Jim Stengel has done research around sort of the top 50 businesses around that have been more profitable, who have a purpose-driven approach versus those that don't.
So a similar question that came in from Sherry Podlosky, one of our audience members, is in the development stage, how much research did you invest in order to understand your competitor's purpose to ensure differentiation? Would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, we did. We did pretty extensive look, both internally in terms of how our own people were viewing us, but also externally to see the landscape. And it wasn't just, by the way, it wasn't just about our direct competitors, but it was about other organizations that were competitors, not necessarily from a business perspective, but competitors from a talent perspective. Because ultimately, as you know, we're only as good as the people that we have. And in this day and age, it was important for us to understand who were our biggest competitors when it came to talent. And oftentimes, that was not in our direct current competitive set from a sales or a marketing perspective. So in terms of the specific answer to the question, I would say, it was, in the $1 million to $1.5 million worth of dollars from a research and investment perspective.
We have a question from Lisa Bottle from Floor. Lisa would like the panelists to speak about how they've managed external versus internal rollout of purpose in terms of approach, timing, messaging, channels. Tom, let's go to you for that one to begin, and then if others would like to piggyback on.
Sure. All of the above. Simple but true. Everything from executive visibility with our CEO carrying the purpose message into every single solitary media interview and speaking engagement and what have you that he has. By the way, this is the next week he'll be, for the first time in his career, at Davos. So on the world stage, if you will, even though Humana is not a global company, maybe we will be starting 1st of February. Social media. Within the corporate communications department at Humana, there's like anybody who joins it has a purpose boot camp. We don't actually call it that, but maybe we should, so that it just becomes second nature for anybody on the CorpCom team to infuse our purpose messaging into anything that we do, even down to the level of responding to negative media inquiries, right? So we'll say, we'll say sometimes, well, this happened and we acknowledge that it happened. It was inconsistent with our purpose. That's a way to get the message across, even in a negative situation. So I'll just go back to my easy first answer, which is deeper and more has a lot more implications than it seems. All of the above.
We have a question from Sandra McLeod that I'm going to ask. Then we're running short on time, so the last question for the panelists is going to be to offer one single most important piece of advice to our audience. But first, let's ask the question from Sarah. Sarah asks the panelists, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently when you first launched Purpose or at the beginning of your effort? So let's go to Colleen for that.
I think it's just making sure that you've got the actions, to support your purpose. Too often, people get excited internally, like we have this amazing purpose, let's go and communicate it. And I think the challenge and the role that you have to play is saying, yes, it is an amazing purpose, and we want to tell everyone about it. Let's make sure we've got the proof points and the actions to support it, and not rush to communicate something that might not feel like you're living it. And so that's the advice that I would have in terms of just making sure you're setting up those mechanisms to drive business accountability for those purpose-driven decisions. And the other thing I would just say is it takes a lot of engagement. You can't do this by yourself. HR is a key partner, marketing is a key partner, strategy is a key partner, your executive team. And so there's just a lot of organization and touch points. And the other thing I'll say is we actually carved out from my team, from an organizational standpoint, several people to just work on purpose internally, because I didn't want them doing the firefighting, if you will, of internal communications. I wanted them proactively driving that narrative. And so we carved that out specifically for them, because there was a lot of heavy lifting in the beginning 2 years, frankly. And then now it's really a part of how we do business. And so they're integrated back into the business, and it's not a separate function.
Yeah, and said another way, to Colleen's point, resist the temptation to move fast, because this is major change management in your organization, and you will need to focus on alignment and getting people really understanding what this is all about, and that just takes time. So that would be my advice.
And mine would be very simply, don't take criticism personally. There will be people in your organization, and in some cases very powerful and influential people, who don't like this idea of having a purpose, and you'll get criticized for it. Don't take it personally. Stay strong.
Well, we're just about out of time. Colleen, did you get a chance to provide your piece of advice in your comment?
Yeah, I think it's similar to everyone else's. My biggest piece of advice in learning is that it took us really 2 years to roll out a purpose statement, and we didn't say anything really year one. It wasn't until year 2. So I would say take your time. I agree with that.
So unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I know that now there's a number of questions that are starting to come in. One of the great benefits of being part of Page is you can access our membership directory and tap into the network for knowledge and research and guidance, because odds are someone in our network's been through it before. So I encourage you, if you have direct questions for specific panelists that you want to ask, shoot them an email. Hopefully they won't mind. They shouldn't, but shoot them an email. And just a few quick house cleaning items before we wrap. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for contributing to today's session. I'd also like to thank all of our audience members for joining the webinar. We hope that you found the conversation to be rich, meaningful, and filled with insights that you can apply at work or apply as you're planning to introduce purpose into your organization. I'd also like to thank Elliot Mizrahi and Annabella Tinoco from Page for their very hard work in facilitating today's session. And as a reminder, please fill out the webinar survey that will be sent to you via email. Last item, before we go, I'd like to let you know that later this year, the Page Society will be launching a new Page Learning Lab, which is a unique online learning program designed to help members of our teams acquire the skills and capabilities they need to succeed in their roles and eventually in ours. Paige ran a pilot of the program in 2017 and will be rolling it out to the full membership in the next few months. If this is something that you might be interested, please look out for the announcements that are going to be coming out in the weeks ahead. So we're out of time. Thank you again for taking part in today's webinar, and have a great afternoon.